Remember, kids, the Battle of Cold Harbor is one of the three battles that we refer to as the Virginia campaigns. We've already talked about the Battle of the Wilderness. We've already talked about the Battle of Spotsylvania. In both battles, the North is trying to push the South to Richmond and end this war. Now, we'll talk about, kind of back up on the Battle of Spotsylvania. Remember, General Grant is commanding the Union forces. In the Battle of Spotsylvania, he continued his march towards Richmond. On May 10th and 12th of 1864, the Confederate and Union forces met again in battle at Spotsylvania. Again, General Lee and the Confederates failed to halt the Union advance to Richmond. So what the Union's doing is just marching closer and closer and closer to Richmond with the eventuality of taking over the Confederate capital and ending the war. Now, we did mention at the Battle of Spotsylvania that Grant was not concerned about loss of life. He lost 12,000 men in that battle. But we did also point out that we don't even give you Confederate losses anymore because any man they lose is a disaster for them. So that'll take us into the Battle of Cold Harbor. And again, after the Battle of Spotsylvania, the Union again marched towards Richmond. And Lee is trying like crazy to halt this march, and he's not having any luck at all. Well, at this particular time in the Civil War, the Union forces are going to encounter Confederate forces at Cold Harbor, Virginia. Now, this was quite a story on the Union side. The Union suffered a disaster. What Grant did is he basically ordered a head-on attack against 6 miles of rebel trench line. And what I mean by 6 miles of rebel trench line doesn't mean that the trench line was 6 miles long. It means it might have been, you know, a half a mile long here, 3/4 of a mile here. But what the rebels had done is they had dug trenches. And they were inside the trenches and they were fighting kind of below ground level to a point. I mean, you understand what I'm saying? Using the trenches to protect themselves. And Grant just orders a head-on attack against 6 miles of rebel trench line. They're just coming right at these trenches and they're trying to fight marching into the trench line, whereas the Confederates are in the trenches firing back at the Confederates. Now, if you were a Union soldier, what would your thought process be as you were ordered to march head-on into 6 miles of rebel trench line? When's it going to be my turn to die? The Union soldiers were so certain that they would be killed in this march that they pinned their names on their shirts so they would not die nameless. They did not want to die nameless. They actually pinned their names on their shirts. They were so sure they were going to be killed in this march. And not in a few days of fighting, but in just a few hours of fighting, 9,000 Union soldiers were killed at Cold Harbor. 9,000 killed in just hours of fighting. Now, in those 3 battles, you know what the casualties were for Grant and the Union in those 3 battles? Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor? 60,000. They had lost 60,000 men, casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. 60,000. That's an incredible amount of people. Now here's the ironic thing about it. When you think about when we go back in the Civil War, at this point in the Civil War, realistically, although the South is faltering, Grant is no closer to taking Richmond than McClellan was 2 years before that. They were basically holding the same ground. In other words, if McClellan would have continued after the South in those battles, we might have been done. So think about that. After all this loss of life and all this fighting that's gone on in the eastern theater of the war, with this victory or loss or whatever it was at Cold Harbor, the Union is no closer to Richmond than they were with McClellan 2 years earlier. So what we're going to do is we're going to switch from the Virginia campaign as we continue to march towards Richmond. Now, you know, we're still making progress, are we not, the Union? They're making progress towards Richmond, but the loss of life is disastrous. Well, we're going to slip back over a little bit into the Western Theater and talk about General Sherman's march to the sea. General Sherman's march to the sea. Now, where's he at this time in our lecture? Where's he at geographically? Yeah, he's near Chattanooga on the Tennessee-Georgia border, and his idea is to sweep through the South, okay? And that's what he's been doing. Well, in September of 1864, Sherman had made it all the way to Atlanta, Georgia, all the way to Atlanta right here. So he has left the Tennessee border, and by September of 1864, he is making an assault upon Atlanta. So in September of 1864, General Sherman led an assault on Atlanta, Georgia. It was kind of similar to Vicksburg. Sherman ordered the bombing of Atlanta. They cut all railroad lines and any transportation lines into the city to basically starve these people out. And the bombing continued of Atlanta for several weeks, and finally, as what happened in Vicksburg, the people couldn't hold out any longer and surrendered. So Sherman's march to the sea starts at the Tennessee-Georgia border, and right now his march is in Atlanta, Georgia, which is about a third of the way into Georgia, with the bombing of Atlanta. He stayed at Atlanta for several weeks, Sherman did, and basically bombed that city into submission. That's what he did. Cut all the railroad lines, any communication lines, any way to get food or communication into that area, and finally they couldn't hold out any longer and surrendered. Well, Sherman continues his march. He leaves Atlanta in flames and heads towards the sea. He's basically going to march from Atlanta straight through Georgia to the sea. Okay, he's going to march to the sea. Now, Sherman didn't have a real detailed plan for this assault. His plan was to live off the land and, quote, make Georgia howl. Okay, that was his plan, was to make Georgia howl. So he leaves again the Tennessee-Georgia border at Chattanooga. He sweeps through Georgia, he stops in Atlanta in September of 1864, puts that city under siege for several weeks, starves them out. They surrender. He continues from Atlanta to the sea, and his goal is to live off the land and, quote, make Georgia howl. What does that mean, Kyle? He's going to make Georgia howl.
Go through killing everybody.
Well, he's going to make them howl that way, and he wants to make them suffer as much as possible for what? What's he making them suffer for? Forever, we'll say it. For seceding the Union. That was that, very good, Kyle. That was his goal. He was going to make Georgia howl. He was going to make the people of the South suffer as much as possible for their decision to secede from the Union. He was kind of a ruthless guy, and he was just pillaging the South from Atlanta on. Now, during this march to the sea, General Sherman's army practiced total war. They practiced total war. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of what total war is. So during their march to the sea, General Sherman's troops practiced what we know in history, Civil War history, as total war. First example of total war is the Union either seized or destroyed anything along the way that they thought might benefit the Confederacy. So the first example of total war on the part of General Sherman and the Union soldiers was they either seized or they destroyed anything along their way that they thought might benefit the Confederacy. Now, if they were marching through and saw a really plump steer along the way that would be a benefit to the Confederacy, if they had control of it, they would either seize it for themselves or just simply shoot it and let it lay and rot so the Confederacy could not use it. That was an example of that. Second thing they did in practicing total war is they destroyed every railroad line they came in contact with at the South. They destroyed every railroad line they saw. Make sure that these people had no way of receiving any supplies or ammunition or anything like that. So they destroyed all railroad lines that they came in contact with. The third thing they did is they fed on all the rich farm products from southern farms. As they went through these southern farms, before they destroyed the farm, they would eat the eggs, drink the milk, feast on the corn, whatever they were growing, and anything they didn't use, what did they do? Destroyed or threw away. So they fed off the rich farm products from southern farms and simply threw everything away they didn't want. Yeah?
Oh, this might be kind of off topic, but did you ever read Gone with the Wind?
I have not read it, I've seen the movie.
And so she is like in Atlanta and then she flees back to her plantation and all the Union troops are going through and like seizing all the plantations and stuff.
Yeah. Frankly, my dear. You know the rest of that?
No.
I'm gone with my famous line, frankly, my dear.
Oh, yeah.
You've heard that, and that was pretty that was pretty scandalous. Hey, that was pretty scandalous at the time for him to say that on TV. You know, so stupid. But very good, yeah, that's true. Gone with the Wind is a very good movie about this type of thing. It was old, very old.
We could.
You could, maybe while I'm gone next week, you could watch it at home on Netflix. All right, let's move to a presidential election. In the middle of this Civil War, we're going to have a presidential election of 1864. Presidential election of 1864. Now this is an interesting election. All these are kind of interesting. Okay, Lincoln is going to want to run for re-election for the Republican Party. The question is, who will he nominate as his vice presidential candidate? And he nominates Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson. So Lincoln will run for the Republicans for re-election in 1864, and his vice presidential running mate will be Andrew Johnson. He'll be a very, very important man in history because what's going to happen to Lincoln shortly after the Civil War? He's going to be assassinated, and that man's going to assume the presidency. And that's a story within itself that we'll cover right after spring break. But anyway, the Republicans nominate Lincoln for re-election and Andrew Johnson as Lincoln's vice presidential running mate. It's kind of interesting because Johnson was a former Democratic congressman from Tennessee. So he's going to represent what area of the country? South. Okay? So Johnson is a former Democratic congressman from Tennessee, which means he served in what in Congress? House of Representatives, right? Because he's not a senator, he's a member of Congress. Okay, so he was a congressman from Tennessee, Democrat. How about what's Lincoln's political party? Republican. So we got a Democratic Southerner in the vice presidency. Guess who the Democratic Party nominated for president? One of the generals that Lee replaced. Who do you think it was? Who did the Democrats nominate for president? McClellan. General George McClellan was the Democratic candidate for president. Now this is still during the time the Civil War is going. Okay, you've got a general running against the president. So the Democratic Party nominated General McClellan. Now, what do you think the people's feeling of it wasn't quite Vietnam yet, but people were starting to question the Civil War a little bit. Mainly because of what? What's got their biggest concern? Loss of life, especially on the part of General Grant. So the Democrats are kind of hoping that there will be an anti-war feeling in 1864, and it might help them defeat Lincoln in this election. That's the hope that the Democrats are running on. Now, they're also concerned, those that have a concern about war, about how long it's lasting. Okay? And so, what might be a great victory that's pretty sure to come, other than Richmond, that might make people think that the war's about over, other than Richmond? What? Well, no, not yet. Who else has actually already got a victory there? And he's marching southward. Okay, taking Atlanta. Okay, the Republicans are hoping that General Sherman's capture of Atlanta would convince these apprehensive voters that are starting to wonder about the war that, hey, the war's about over. Look at this. We're close to Richmond. Sherman's captured Atlanta. We're done here. So that's kind of what the Republicans are banking on, that people say, hey, the war's about over. Okay, we're close to Richmond. Sherman's taken Atlanta. He's moving on towards the sea. I think we're about to wrap this thing up. That's what they were gambling on. What were the Democrats gambling on? The fact that these anti-war people would vote for him. Okay? Well, when it all came out in the wash, Lincoln won an overwhelming victory. There were 233 electoral votes possible to gain in this election, 233. and Lincoln received 212 of those. So it was an overwhelming victory for President Lincoln, 212 to 233, which kind of quieted the issue that maybe people were against the war. They evidently were not, because he won such a big victory. 212 out of 233 he received. Okay, moving on then, we'll talk about the Deep South falling to the Union. The Deep South falling to the Union. What do you think the next big city is that Sherman has his eyes set on as he goes through? Big city that would be a port city in Georgia. Very good, Savannah. So, in December of 1864, General Sherman telegraphs Lincoln, who's been newly re-elected. In December of 1964, in December of 1864, General Sherman telegraphs Lincoln back at the White House shortly after his re-election. And this is what the telegraph said, basically. Quote, "I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah," which told Lincoln that he had captured Savannah as well, important port city. So in December of 1864, General Sherman telegraphs the newly re-elected President Lincoln, and the telegraph states, quote, "I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah." So he basically now has swept the Deep South. So by January of 1865, the Confederacy was all but defeated. I'm going to give you 3 reasons why. By January of 1865, the Confederacy was all but defeated. One reason that the Confederacy was all but defeated, number 1, Atlanta had fallen. Atlanta and Savannah had fallen. Atlanta and Savannah had fallen to the Union. The second reason the Confederacy was all but defeated is the Deep South was penetrated by the Union forces and swept clean. Okay? The Deep South had been penetrated by Union forces and swept clean. And what might be another important thing that the Confederate would need to continue to fight? Well, soldiers, but what do you need to equip those soldiers with? And what does it take to do that? Money. Number 3, the Confederate government was basically bankrupt. So by January of 1865, the Confederacy was all but defeated. Atlanta and Savannah had fallen to the Union, 2 important southern cities. Number 2, the Deep South had been penetrated by Union forces and swept clean. And number 3, the Confederate government was bankrupt. Even though the prospects were so bleak, Confederate President Jefferson Davis told his rebel soldiers to fight on until they could fight no more. So even though Confederate President Jefferson Davis knew that things were very bleak, he ordered the rebel soldiers to fight on until they could fight no more. Did they obey his order? Absolutely. Okay, so even though the Confederate prospects were so bleak, Confederate President Jefferson Davis told the rebel soldiers to fight on until they could fight no more, and they obeyed his order. Okay, that's going to take us to our next subtopic, the surrender of both Petersburg and Richmond. Petersburg and Richmond. The end is near, kids. The 2 Virginia strongholds that the Confederates still had at this point were Petersburg and Richmond. Not too far apart, but 2 important cities. Well, what is Union General Sherman doing now that he captured Savannah? What's he doing now? He's marching northward, towards Virginia. That was the plan, okay? So Sherman is marching closer and closer to Richmond from the south, and Confederate General Lee's troops are getting thinner and thinner with all these battles we've talked about, the Virginia campaigns. Well, another Union general under Grant's command, Philip Sheridan, who you'll hear a lot about when we talk about the Plains Indian Wars, Union General Philip Sheridan and his army were closing in on Richmond from the north. So you had Sherman pressing from the south, Philip Sheridan and his troops from the north, and Grant in the middle. You see what I'm saying here, how this is working? Well, in April, early April of 1865, Lee cannot hold Petersburg any longer. He's low on food, he's low on soldiers, and in early April of 1865, he abandons Petersburg. He abandons it. So what's the only place left to capture for the Union to end the war? Richmond. So Petersburg, which was basically set up in a way to protect Richmond, Lee's forced to abandon Petersburg in early April of 1865. Later that same month, in April of 1865, Lee surrenders what? Richmond. And before they leave Petersburg and Richmond, Lee orders his soldiers to set fire to anything they believed the Union would want or could use. So in both instances, when they fled or surrendered, both Petersburg and Richmond, General Lee ordered the Confederate soldiers to set fire to anything that they believed the Union would want or could use. So finally, kids, after 4 long years of fighting, the Union captured the Confederate capital of Richmond. Okay, which leaves the only thing that can happen at this point for the Confederate